Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody, welcome to the next episode of the podcast, and this one here is a little bit special because it is the first time that I'm going to do listener Q&A. So it's just trying out a different format. Instead of me picking a topic, I just asked people on my Facebook page to give me some questions, and then I'll try to give a decent answer. So that's the goal of this episode here. Just a quick overview, what else is new, what else is going on. Well, I'm still obviously doing my rehab for my shoulder, going quite well. I had a little bit of a setback with a little bit of pain, and we had to dial down a little bit some of the exercises that I was doing to rehab. That's going better now, so I can pretty much get back on track. So I'm hopeful that in about a month and a half, I should be able to resume my normal training schedule again. And I'm actually quite looking forward to that. So a lot of you asked, well, how my rehab was going. So there you go. It's going quite well again. That's the first thing. And second point I wanted to mention is, again, I've got some questions from some of you listeners about that. So I'm still working on the Boxing for Self-Defense book. I'm actually rewriting and editing. I've been doing so for a while now, and it's going quite well. So I hope to have it finished by the end of April. And if possible, I will be able to release that one very soon. It all depends on a bunch of factors, and one of them is also the company that I work with when it comes to formatting both the paper and the ebook version. They're quite busy. They're doing a move, so we'll see how that goes as far as delays or how much time it takes to get everything done. But as always, if you want to stay up to date about anything that I have that's coming out with regards to books and videos and so on, you can get on my notification list. That's wimdemeere.com/notification. And you just put your email address in there, and then I'll shoot you an email whenever something new comes out. And typically I always do a promotion when I launch something. So that's pretty much it. Again, I'll put the link in the show notes. So I hope to have that book finished really soon, so I can start working on all the other books. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be a 3-part series, the Boxing for Self-Defense books. And I think I'll be able to cover the topic fairly in detail if I can do it that way. So that's what's coming up in the future. Moving on now to my first question. So I'll read it first. This one is from James Stan, and James asked, if you teach Tuishu, which is pushing hands, how do you frame it in a practical context for your students, and how much emphasis do you place on it overall? As many of you know, I teach a style called Practical Tai Chi Chuan. I've been training in that for over 20 years now. And if you're not familiar with push hands with Tuishu, I'll put some videos in the show notes of me doing push hands and how we practice that, so you get a better idea if this is something that you're not familiar with. Now, before I'll answer, I will only talk about my style. I don't practice the different styles of Tai Chi. I don't exactly know all the details of why they do the things they do, so I'm not going to comment on them. I'm only going to talk about the style that I teach and practice, and hopefully it's going to be useful for anybody who practices a different style of Tai Chi. So that out of the way, something else. It's not unique, this concept, to Tai Chi. However, I would argue that the way it is done in practice is maybe a little bit unique. But many martial arts have something similar. For instance, when you look at wrestling and judo, they have lots of drills where they teach sensitivity, manipulating the body of an opponent, and so on. Styles like Kali and Arnis, the Filipino styles, they have tons of sensitivity drills to manipulate an opponent, in particular when he's using a weapon at close range. So if you practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or any sort of ground fighting grappling system, you should be intimately familiar with the concept of sensitivity, not just with your eyes, but being in contact with an opponent and both reacting to whatever he's doing by tactile feedback, but also you using your own body to create openings, manipulate him, control him, and so on. So the whole concept is in my opinion, not something that is unique. in Tai Chi. However, I do feel that the way it is implemented and the way it is practiced is very different from what you find in other arts. And that brings it to what James's point said is that it's hard to frame that sometimes in a more practical context for people who are new to the art, because it looks a little bit weird if you don't understand what's going on. So I'll try to explain that a little bit from my perspective. Now, in my school, we practice it every class. It's an integral part of the class, and I think it's a critical component of the style. And just to give you a little bit of background, when I started, I'd been training for a long time in a hard style kung fu. I was doing Muay Thai and so on. I was competing. I was in pretty good shape. Well, the smallest guy in class, he could break my balance at will when we were doing freestyle pushing hands. So for me, that was an eye opener, because if he came to a fight, I would have been able to pick that guy up, turn him upside down, and drop him on his head with no problem, because I was a lot stronger and heavier than he was. But he would just push me around and put me on my ass when we did freestyle pushing hands. And I was like, okay, if this little guy can do that to me, what can I do at my weight class? If at my weight and with my strength levels, if I can learn to get that kind of skill. So that was why I thought it was really interesting as far as training concepts are concerned, and I really tried to get a lot better at that, and hopefully succeeded. Now, a little bit more of background as well on how this is typically done in Tai Chi. It's there are formal drills, and these focus on specific aspects. We have specific drills we do for footwork. There's a lot of footwork involved. Other drills are much more stationary. Some drills are relatively complex, others are pretty straightforward, and they all focus on specific aspects of how you would need to apply that in a real situation. For instance, one of our drills is called 7-star step. It's primarily based on footwork. You're using triangular footwork, you're learning to cut the angles, you're learning to divert an incoming attack, you're learning to reposition yourself into a better place to apply your own technique, obviously. So it's it has a very heavy emphasis on the footwork. Whereas another one, which is called 4 directions, I wouldn't say it's fully stationary. There is some footwork, but a lot less. And it focuses on being able to generate force from a standing position by using weight transfers, diverting an incoming attack if you can't step, and so on. And when do you absolutely need to step? Figuring out, well, what is the limit of what you can do? How far can you go forward or backwards before you have to step? Depending also on the reaction you're getting from your opponent. So it teaches very specific things. It's individual drill. Then we get to freestyle, what we call freestyle pushing hands, and that is more about applying the things that you learned during the more formal drills. For instance, we do 3 different kinds. It's called fixed step, restricted step, and moving step, depending on how much footwork is allowed. Fixed step, as the name says, is pretty much you are not allowed to step. You stay in position and you try to break each other's balance. That's pretty much it. The critical part here is that you try to break your opponent's balance without losing your own balance. So the whole point is that you should be able to stay in balance, in position, which means that you are in control of the encounter as you try to disrupt your opponent's balance. And the application is very simple in a sense that if you can manage to do that when somebody attacks you, you can break his balance, put him either off balance so he cannot defend against whatever you're doing as far as the technique is concerned, or you can drop him to the ground, which is a position in which he's very much at a disadvantage. That is a clear tactical advantage if you can acquire such a skill. So that's a direct application right there for you, James. Now, in application, you want to be able to blend all the different things you learn, both in the formal and freestyle exercises as far as pushing hands is concerned. So if you look at, like I just said, the freestyle part, we work with fixed step, which is not moving at all, no footwork, but you can obviously in an actual encounter, use small steps or big steps or anything in between, and apply similar concepts and techniques that you experienced there. So the whole idea is that you don't see all the different drills and so on. You don't see them as separate things, but you see them as part of a larger whole, and you try to look at it as a skill set, as opposed to individual techniques you apply in certain circumstances. So that is one of the ways that I always try to explain it to students when I teach, is it's something that you need to acquire. It's a skill set. For instance, when you look at Japanese martial arts in judo, and I think also in jiu-jitsu, they call it kuzushi, which is breaking balance. And they have a method of teaching that. Well, that is an integral part of pretty much any throw you do, is you need to be able to break the guy's balance before you can effectively throw him. I know there are exceptions, but overall the concept holds true. Now, if you cannot do that correctly, you're going to find it very difficult to do a judo throw. So in judo, you specifically train breaking somebody's balance, because it's an integral part of the art. And I would say that in Tai Chi Chuan, it is exactly the same thing. Not necessarily for throwing. You can obviously break somebody's balance so you can punch or kick him in a better way, or you can slap a joint lock on him in a much easier fashion. So it's not just the throw or the sweep itself that counts. So that's a little bit of background and the way that I view it. Now, more practically speaking, and this is in particular for the people, for the listeners among you who are less experienced or who haven't done this before, there's usually three components to push hands. That is, the first is to listen to force, to feel the attack coming at you, the force that's directed at you. Then redirecting it, getting it away from you so it doesn't land, so it can be used against you. And then you discharge force. Then you use force yourself to counterattack the opponent, the person that's going at you. Now, this is a process, listening to force, redirecting, and then discharging your own force. This process is drilled and practiced in all different drills of push hands, formal and informal, that we have, to make it an instinctive reaction. So you don't have to think about it. You don't have to analyze for a couple of minutes. Well, he's pushing at me from that angle in a straight line. It's going to be about half his force that's going to be in there. So I think I'm going to deflect at a 45-degree angle. You don't have time for that. It needs to be instinctive. It needs to be immediate. Obviously, it needs to be trained. It's not just about doing anything you like. You want to have an appropriate response, which is, again, all the drilling that we do to get used to what works, what doesn't work. For instance, one of the things you don't want to do is use brute strength, and that means that in an example of somebody trying to push you, you don't push back. You try to yield, you try to use his push against him. Another aspect to pushing hands is that you shouldn't see it as something separate, and I hinted at that a little bit before, but you have to look at it as an integrated whole. When you look at Tai Chi, it's not just we do some applications, we do some forms, we do some weapons, we do some push hands, and it's all separate parts. They're supposed to be working together. So and that means that it's a skill that you acquire by doing pushing hands, and it should always be on. There shouldn't be an on-off switch. It should always be functioning. And this takes a lot of specific training. Now, this fits into the way that our system is built, because it has several premises. For instance, we prefer to counterattack and use the opponent's attack against him. Now, that doesn't mean that we never strike preemptively. We will most definitely do that when the necessity and the opportunity is there. But for a bunch of reasons, we prefer to counterattack, because then we can actually use the opponent's attack against him, using his strength, using the openings and the weaknesses that he provides, and try to beat him that way. And to make that work, I think it is critical to understand that you need pushing hand skills. You need the skills you develop in push hands to make that work well. One of the reasons why we prefer to work like this is because we're assuming that we're going to eventually face a stronger, heavier opponent. So just using brute strength is not going to work because he's got more of it. So relying on always being the strongest, fastest, heaviest guy when you have to fight is a losing strategy because it's not always going to be the case. Good for you if you're the Incredible Hulk and you're a huge guy with tons of muscles on him, but that's not the case for everybody. So we don't try to rely on strength and muscle and so on. Quite on the contrary. So given the assumptions that I just mentioned, we need a specific approach that is different than just standing in front of the guy and slugging it out. So that is why the pushing hands is so critical in our system and why we spend so much time training it, because it fits together with how everything else works. Now, I don't know, James, in your style, how that's the case. Like I said, I'm just mentioning how we like to do it, how I teach, and how it makes sense for us. That brings me to another point, and that's the following. Whatever you're doing with the pushing hand skills, the way you redirect force and so on, you need the ability to flow into whatever technique that is appropriate at any given time. Whether it's punching, kicking, a joint lock, throwing or sweeping, whatever. It doesn't matter what the technique is, you need the ability to flow into that appropriate technique. And then you need the ability to go back to pushing hands and then go back to a technique and so on. So switching over and back. Now, one of the first things I learned from my teacher is that he said it's very easy to go from soft to hard, from relaxed to tension. It's very easy. It's very difficult to go from hard to soft, meaning that if you just punch somebody, it's easy to stay in that aggressive state. It's easy to keep on punching, as opposed to going back to more controlling and the softer, quote unquote, aspects of the art. But I believe it is a key to effective self-defense. And we actually do have specific push hands drills that train this part, and it's called reeling silk in our style, where you specifically train to work with the soft and the hard part, in going from one to the other, and there are different applications of how we work with that. But the whole idea is that you shouldn't be stuck in one mindset, and I think that's one of the big misunderstandings people have about Tai Chi Chuan, is that for some reason they think that just because we do our forms slowly and there's a lot of softness involved, is that's how you're supposed to defend yourself. It's complete nonsense. It's people who watch too many movies and they believe that kind of nonsense. But fighting is violent. Fighting is it tends to be very chaotic, and it's rarely, if ever, pretty, and it rarely, if ever, resembles anything from out of the form. So if that's the standard people have, then obviously I can imagine that they don't see any value in push hands and all the other so-called soft stuff. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, again, looking for some more explanations that you might give your students. Again, something that my teacher told me, and he said it's more on a tactical level, but the skills from pushing hands, they allow you to move from position to position if there's a need for you to move. Let's say that I'm on the inside, I blocked the punch or whatever, I defended against the big haymaker, I'm on the inside, but for some reason I don't want to be there. It might be that I feel that I can't hold the position, is that he's moving his arm in and he's overpowering me, or it might be that there's an environmental factor, is that he just brought me closer to traffic, whatever. I stepped into the wrong direction, but I didn't have a choice. I had to get out of the way. Or it might be that there's a second opponent who is going to be able to come at my back if I stay there. So for a variety of reasons, I need to move. Now, I can't just step back and say, okay, let's start over and I'm going to go to the other side this time. That doesn't work. So you need the ability to move from one place to another and do that in a safe way. And in that regard, pushing hands is actually quite useful. So you learn how to manipulate the body, how to manipulate your own, how to look at how can I achieve a better position, and which angles, which footwork should I use, and so on. So you can actually improve your position and work from there. And another aspect of that is that it allows you to chain your techniques together in a situation where your opponent moves because of something you did to him or because of something that he decided to do. And then I get back to the violence being chaotic thing, is that you might have a plan. If he punches you, you're going to do this and this and that. And then you start doing that when he punches, and all of a sudden something goes wrong. He moves a little bit differently, or your technique, it's a glancing blow instead of a full hit, and it doesn't get the effect you want, and so on. And all of a sudden you have to move. Then you don't have time to think about it. You need to move right away, and obviously do the next technique to beat your opponent, to control him, or whatever the goal is. And that is something that pushing hands teaches you to do as well, again, if it's trained correctly. Now, if it's something you did, I see this not enough addressed, in my opinion, in a lot of the training that I see, Tai Chi or otherwise, is that your opponent's not going to stand still if you hit him hard, as an example. Impacts, especially if you have a lot of power, if you trained well and you hit hard, impacts tend to create results. Now, they are not all that always as predictable as we would like, but for instance, if you pack a pretty decent punch and you punch a guy in the face, there's a high likelihood that his head is gonna snap back. That means that that head might be out of reach for your next punch that you plan on doing. Well, then you need to be able to adapt to that. Or let's say that his head snaps back a little bit, but then he drops forward because he's stumbling forward and is a little bit out of control, and he's closing in on you all of a sudden. And then you find yourself at close range where you maybe didn't want to be. So all that can happen in an instant, and you need the ability to manage that and link your techniques together when the situation changes. And this is an integral part of the push hands training that you do. So that is another really specific reason of why I think it's important that you need to practice that in class. Now, an overarching concept an underlying concept, let's put it that way, is that the reaction speed between visual cues and tactile feedback is different. When you're at close range, in particular, touch is quicker than vision. Now, this is one of the demonstrations that I always do with new students to explain this concept to them, because it helps them understand why there's such a need to practice our pushing hands. And it's very simple. I ask them, okay, to take a few steps back. They're pretty much out of range, and I tell them, you just throw a right straight punch at my face. At first, they do that very slowly, obviously, because they know and they don't really understand what's going on, and they don't really want to hurt me, so they give me this slow punch. And I parry it, or I move my head out of the way, and I said, fine, okay, do it again, faster. And eventually I get them to throw a really fast, powerful punch. And again, if you know what the punch that's coming, because I'm asking them to do a right straight punch, obviously, because it's a demo, it's not a fight, then it's usually very easy to deflect and defend against that punch. Now, then I ask them to come a little bit closer, and then they are in range. And I said, okay, do the same punch, but do it slowly now. And then they notice that it's much easier to get really close to my face with their fist. And then we pick up the speed again, and we always very quickly get to the point where I have to just move my head out of the way real fast and be really on point with my parrying technique, because otherwise it's going to land. And then I ask them if they notice a difference. See that do they now feel confident that they can hit me in the face if they go even a little bit faster, as fast as they did before when they were out of range? Usually they say, yep, I think I can land it. I said, excellent. So you know that if you can get that punch off a little bit quicker, that you're going to punch me in the face, right? I say, yes. Okay. Then I say, we're going to do it again. You can go as fast as you like. And this time I'm going to put my hand in contact with their right arm. Doesn't matter where it is. Could be at the wrist, could be at the elbow, could be at the upper arm, doesn't matter. I'm just going to be lightly in contact. So I don't push, I don't pull, I don't grab. I just put my hand on in contact with their punching arm. And I say, punch whenever you want. And invariably, they hardly get the shot off, because at that distance, tactile feedback is quicker than vision. And I asked him to try a couple times, and then we do it again. I said, look, okay, do it again, and this time I'm going to close my eyes. I close my eyes, and invariably, because tactile feedback is quicker, they never get a shot off. They can start punching, and I can divert it as it starts and really early on in the punch, as opposed to having to deal with it at the end. So that is a typical demonstration that I do, and this concept underlies a lot of what we do in as far as pushing hands when it comes to using it effectively for self-defense. Is that you need to understand that at this range, feeling is going to be much quicker. So we want to develop a skill set at that level. And it's used in different ways, and the most practical way that I can compare it to is that use it as a radar system. We like to call it listening with our hands. So you don't use the radar visually, but you use it to know where your opponent's body is in relation to yours. So how high is his arm? How low is it? Is it moving to the left? Is it moving to the right? Is his body weight pressing forward? Is it going away from me? And so on. So all this information you get just by having tactile feedback. And then you know where he is in relation to you and how he is moving. Now, this lets you make good tactical decisions, and it tells you which techniques to use. For instance, so when you look at self-defense, what very often happens is that people start punching and then they close in and they start clinching. Now, if clinching and close range fighting happens, well, in both these cases, there's going to be physical contact. You're going to have tactile feedback, whether you like it or not. So push hands teaches you to deal with that. Second point, fighting is, like I said, it's very chaotic. Now, you don't always see the attack well, and that makes orienting yourself on your opponent a lot more difficult. Once you have tactile feedback, if you've been trained correctly, it's a lot easier to figure out what to do because you've been there before. You've worked with a moving body at close range with tactile feedback in your training. It's not new to you. And another example, for instance, let's say what happens if you are attacked and it's nighttime and you really literally can't see well. Or you're in a location with poor lighting and all you see is pretty much a blur of movement and then the fight's on. And then tactile feedback is going to be almost the only thing you're going to get to use to figure out what's going on. So these are just a couple of examples of, again, how that idea of a radar system of giving you information is critical to using it for self-defense. Now, at the highest levels of skill, when it comes to push hands, you can break somebody's balance easily while you're always staying balanced and you're only using the smallest movements or using his smallest movements and getting the job done. This takes a lot of time, a lot of practice, and it's quite difficult to get right. However, at the highest levels, it's an incredibly valuable skill because it allows you to do a lot of things that people don't think are either possible or they don't understand the consequences of you being able to do that. For instance, one of the things that I tell my students all the time is that you practice this. So assume that your opponent also knows this. So every single touch is a potential attack because you know that at that range, when you allow somebody to put his hands on you, no matter how soft the touch is, you know what you can do with that. You know that you can attack somebody right away and you don't have time to defend. Your opponent doesn't have time to defend if you get your hands on him in that way. Well, assume the same thing's going to happen to you. So every touch is a potential attack. So you don't give anybody the chance to do that. And if he lets you get away with that, if your opponent lets you put your hands on him, and it's a very soft touch at first, but you know how hard you can explode into a movement once you're in that position. Well, that's tough break for him. He shouldn't have let you do that. So I think I covered a lot of ground, and I'll end up with two stories. I've told them before, but I don't think I've told them on the podcast before. So the head instructor of the style that I practice, Dan Doherty, we went to, he organizes seminars. I went to several of his seminars, to put it that way. I organized them with my teacher and so on. And we were doing freestyle pushing hands, and it was a drill in which we were trying to do elbow strikes and shoulder strikes to the chest. So the idea is that you're in contact, you're moving freely, you're not supposed to break the contact that you have with your hands and arms and so on. And you are trying to move in on each other and slam a forearm or an elbow or a shoulder strike into the chest of your partner. You can do this hard, you can do this soft. I wouldn't say we were going all out. I'm sure Dan wasn't going all out. But it's quite interesting. You can pack quite an impact with these kind of movements, and it's trying to trick each other. It's trying to get past the defenses of your partner, because obviously if he feels you coming in with an elbow or a shoulder strike, he's going to try to get out the way and divert your attack. So we were doing that. Now I think I was about 200 pounds then, something along those lines, and I was in really good shape. Now, and as Dan was pushing me at certain points, I was able to hold my frame, to hold my arm in position, but I would slide backwards across the floor, and it looked like he wasn't really trying all that hard, and I was literally like in the movies sliding back across the floor, and it wasn't like I wasn't trying to stand still or divert his attack. It was just there was so much force coming at me, and I couldn't do anything about that. Now, during that same exercise, I was obviously not getting all that far with my attacks because he was defending against everything and I didn't get through. So I was like, okay, let's try something else. So I tried a silat elbow that I learned in one of the silat styles that I practice. And it's a very sneaky one because it can start from a very light touch, very light contact. And then the way you use the leverage of the contact, it sneaks underneath the arm and it goes straight with the point, really hard towards the body. You can do a lot of damage with that elbow. I wasn't trying to go all out, obviously, but I was going fast. I wasn't going hard, but I was going as quickly as possible just to try to get close, because nothing was working when we were practicing. Now, I've done the elbow before in my training. I've practiced it a lot. I know what it feels like when it lands. I know when it's true. And that was the feeling I had. Like, okay, I was working with Dan. I tried the elbow. I move in at speed. And I'm like, I'm in. And then the fraction of a second later, Dan disappears like as if from magic. He moves to my left side. And then I get thrown towards my right side. And I'm completely off balance. So I thought I was in. I was wrong. He just all of a sudden he accelerated from 0 to 50,000 miles per hour, and it was like almost that mythical figure you see in the martial arts movies, the old kung fu movies. It was that kind of feeling. That was one of the few times that I actually experienced this kind of thing with my teachers. I've had it with different teachers. Similar experiences where you all of a sudden notice that, well, there's actually a whole other level that you can get to if you train really hard. So, and then I wanted to mention that story. Obviously, just to finish it, we resumed training and everything was fine. But and I don't think he said anything about that. But I was like, okay, I can't touch this man. It's not going to work. So we kept on training, and it was a really interesting experience for me. Because it showed me, and that's interesting when it comes to the next question I'm going to answer, it showed me how our style can actually be used against different styles, and how it's really solid on that level as well, but also something to work towards too in my own training. I don't think I'm at that point yet, not by far, but it's something to look forward to in the sense that you know that, okay, there's this very high level that you can get at where you can do specific things, where a lot of people, when you tell the story, and I've told this story to many people, a bunch of people look at me like, yeah, nonsense, this is nonsense. I'm like, okay, well, you don't have to believe it. I know what happened. I was there, you weren't, but fine if you don't want to believe it. But it's something to aspire to, let's put it that way. So long explanation for you, James. I hope this makes sense. Just to make it clear, if you're not practicing pushing hands in your Tai Chi class, I don't see the point of it when it comes to claiming you teach self-defense, because if you're not doing it, you're crippling the style. That's the first part. And the second part is that it's it's something that takes a while to really get good at or really just understand how it functions. It took me a while, and I'd been training for a long time. And when I started with my Tai Chi training many years ago, it was very difficult at first to adapt to that whole mindset of practicing pushing hands the way we do it in our school. So I hope that helps you with your students and your training partners. If you have any additional comments, obviously you can let me know. So that's the first question. And then we move to question number 2, and it's from Dan Wayne. And he asked, how about all the training you go through and then real fighting, because they're not the same. So for instance, you're trained to fight somebody that fights a similar system that you do, but in a real fight, it's not like that. So let's just say Taekwondo, and you practice Taekwondo and the guy has a knife, and it just doesn't work. Different ways I can respond to this question. First of all, I'd like to say is that not every system is like this. Not every system is only effective in fighting people who fight in a similar system or who fight in the same way. It does happen. I've seen it happen with many styles where they overly focus on their own type of techniques, but it's not necessarily so. One of the art or categories of martial arts in which you see it a lot is martial sports, combat sports. Now, these have competition rules, and the rules will always determine which techniques and which tactics are most practical to use. As a result, competitors will mostly train how to handle those techniques and so on, and try to make the rules work in their favor. Now, as with all sports, over time the details change, the sport evolves, and the rules change, and so on. So and all that becomes even more specialized. And if you practice a combat sport, I think this is an incredibly important issue to understand. For instance, when you look at sports Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the way they compete nowadays, there's no striking allowed. So the only thing they can do is grapple and put in joint locks, sometimes throws, takedowns, and so on. Choking techniques, all those kind of things are allowed, but no striking. Now, recently, Eddie Bravo, he opened up with his Combat Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournament, and there you had open hand strikes that were allowed. So kind of like slapping-like techniques and so on. Now that changes the techniques that are used, or the way they are used, the tactics, the strategies, and so on. So, and that is a big difference. If you never train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with striking techniques allowed, then why would you care about them? It's not relevant to you. It's not relevant to your sport, so why would you even consider that in your training? Because you don't care, because you will not encounter that in your competitions, so you don't have to practice defending against them. And then you enter that combat BJJ tournament, and all of a sudden you get slapped around, and it's going to be difficult to make whatever you did before work. So that's one aspect. And again, staying with combat sports, the same thing happened when you look at old Pride fights and compare that to the UFC rules. For instance, in Pride in Japan, they allowed soccer kicks and stomp kicks on a downed opponent. Now, when that happened, when a fighter went down and his opponent was still standing, there were very few guys who stayed on the ground, because they knew that their opponent was going to come on over and soccer kick them in the back of the head, or stomp their face in with their heel and so on. So they tried to get up right away. Now compare that to today's UFC fights, in which this is not allowed. So there's a lot of fighters, they're perfectly fine staying on the ground because they know they're relatively safe from striking techniques from a standing opponent, as long as they can get their feet positioned towards their opponent. And the guy standing there, he's going to try to get past those feet, and there's a bunch of techniques that are working, that you can use to achieve that goal. But because they're not even trying to kick the face or knee or stomp kick to the face, this kind of tactic is allowed. Now, again, compared to, and you can look on YouTube, you'll find old Pride fights, and I'll see if I can put some of them in the comment and in the show notes. If you look at the guys doing the pride fights, once there was a kick coming at them, or once they saw that the guy was trying to get past the legs that they were aiming at the standing opponent, they very, very quickly, I wouldn't say go into panic mode, but they were extremely motivated to not stay lying on their backs on the ground. Because if you fail at keeping that guy in front of you with your feet, he's likely to knock you out, or at the very least damage you. So that completely changes how you fight. If everybody fights the way you do, then it's not an issue. But that doesn't always apply. All right, giving you a final example. Throughout the years, the UFC has made some changes to it, but the definition of a downed opponent changed all the time. And it used to be, for instance, that if one of the best examples, I think it was Randy Couture who did that against, I forget who, but his opponent had Randy up against the cage, and he was in a reasonably good position, and Randy was in a bad position. So what did he do? He just put his fingertips touching the floor, and that meant that his opponent couldn't knee him in the face anymore, which would have been a really effective technique from the position that he was holding Randy in. So that is obviously complete nonsense in the sense of what is the most useful technique at that point. Now, it's smart on Randy's part. Obviously, it's very smart. It's using your rules to your benefit, which every competitor is always trying to do. But what if that is allowed? Well, then if he tries to put his fingers on the ground, it's going to get kneed in the face and probably knocked out. So again, if you are used to working within a system that has certain rules, certain concepts, a certain way of going about things, and that's all you do, well, then you're likely to run into trouble. And again, I just gave you all these examples. I could give many more, but I've seen this happen a lot when it comes to combat sports, is that they are used to training with people who fight like them, and when they fight with somebody who's from a different combat sport, it's very awkward. For instance, back in the day when it was full contact kickboxing, no leg kicks allowed, and there were some really great fighters in that sport, and then they all of a sudden they tried to do some Muay Thai as well, where it was knee strikes and elbow strikes and a lot of leg kicks and clinching and so on. That was allowed, and a lot of those guys back in the late 70s and 80s, they got beat up by the guys doing Muay Thai, because it was very different. They fought really, really different because they had a different rule set. So that's the first really big part that I wanted to mention about this. Now, like I said, I don't agree that this is always the case, that you're trained to only fight people who fight in a similar way, because in many traditional martial arts this is often less the case. Not always, but usually it doesn't work like that. Now, how do those styles that I'm talking about work? Well, they have a very specific method of doing things and a view on how to handle violence. And there's usually a context to that. So, for instance, some arts, they focus heavily on weapons, and others don't because, for instance, weapons weren't as available in the society that art originated from. Some styles have an emphasis on specific stances and techniques because of like I said, an environmental factor. And just to give you an example, fighting in a tropical jungle during monsoon season, it's not the same as doing so in the mountains in winter. So it's a completely different environment, and you have to make sure that your techniques work in the environment that you live. So styles tend to adapt to their environment and to their context. And I think the best way you can view a martial art or combative systems, a specific style, as a specialized solution to a specific problem. So it's a specialized solution to a specific problem. Now, one conclusion that you can draw out of that is that you shouldn't expect to find a perfect style that can handle all context and all environments equally well. And giving you an example, if your style has a lot of blocking techniques, and with blocking I mean stopping the incoming force and you're absorbing the impact. For instance, when I look at boxing, A boxing just blocking and covering up when somebody throws a hook punch to their head. They just bring the elbow up, the hand up, and they absorb the full impact. Well, if that's the part that's an instinctive or a standard response in whatever style you practice, you're extremely vulnerable to weapon attacks. Because if somebody's slashing at you with a razor, sure, your block will intercept the technique, but you're going to get cut. If somebody swings at you with a tire iron or a hammer or whatever that he's holding in his hand, and you just block it the way a boxer blocks a hook, I mean, sure, there's something in the way of the weapon, but your arm's going to be messed up. And it's not going to be something you can do a second time in all likelihood. So I don't think a perfect style exists that allows you to defend against every single type of opponent in every single context, regardless of whatever is going on, that you can just, do this style and everything works. I really don't think that's possible. So if there's no perfect solution, I think the best thing you can do is you find a style that is best suited to you and your specific needs. Now, what kind of attacks are you most likely to encounter? Well, train for those. What do you bring to the table? Are you big? Are you not? Are you a big guy? Are you strong? Are you not? You got long arms, long legs, short, whatever. What are your physical specific traits that you bring to the table that will be a factor in case should you defend yourself? And look at your environment, look at your specific needs, and then train for those. Find a way to adapt whatever you're doing to your specific needs. Your mission goal, keeping yourself safe, comes first. And then you have to look at the terrain, look at the opponent, look at the enemy, see what's going on, and then look for the right tools that you need. You don't pick the tool first. You pick the goal first. Your goal is survive, be safe, defend yourself, and so on. Well, if that's the case, well, then you look at what that means for you specifically in your context, in your life, in your daily life, and then you look for the tools that will allow you to do that. So I think that's the best way to look at it when it comes to making a style work, is that you have to be very honest to yourself. Now, that said, there are some other options. For instance, there are complementary styles. I mostly practice Chinese styles, and for instance, there's Bachi Chuan and Piqua Chuan, and these are complementary systems. Now, Bachi is very heavy on elbows. They like to move in close and go through the guy and so on. And Piqua is a lot more swinging techniques with open hands. They have some more distance stuff and so on, and they are really good complements to each other. Now, for all the practitioners of those styles, yes, I know that I'm oversimplifying things. I know, I'm just trying to make a point. But the point is that there are ways to look at whatever style you're practicing. Let's say, like you said, you do Taekwondo, competitive style Taekwondo, and you've got a guy with a knife in front of you. Well, in all likelihood, a jump spinning back kick is not going to be the smartest answer to that problem. So you're going to have to find something that complements that style that you already practice. To do that, you have to, like I said, be very honest with yourself, and you have to figure out what your art is lacking and find a compatible art to study along with it. So I wouldn't call it patching the holes in your system. I wouldn't see it like that. I would see it more along the lines of you need an extra skill set. You have certain skills because of the art you practice, and they allow you to be very good at certain things, not so good at others. Well, what do you need for those others? Finding a compatible art is not easy, because not all arts play well together. For instance, I had to abandon the Chinese hard style that I practiced for years when I wanted to really get better at my Tai Chi Chuan, because they were incompatible for a large variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into. But that was a bad mix. I couldn't do both at the same time. I had to pick one. Now, I'll give you another example. I've been teaching for a long time now in the Tai Chi style that I do. And what I've noticed is that a lot of people who practice Japanese styles, they have a very hard time making it work for them. Because the body mechanics, the way that they think, and the way that they practice, the way that they see techniques and so on, the Tai Chi doesn't work for them. Now, there are obviously exceptions, but I've seen this come back over and over in the last 20 years. So it's an issue when you look at complementary style, is that you have to pick one that actually doesn't completely break down what you've already learned. Obviously, also, if you do find that that's actually the case, like I had to make a choice, maybe you're going to have to make a choice to find a different style altogether. Or you might get lucky and find one that is actually really compatible and is just a ticket for you. So there's no easy answers to this question. The only thing that I can say to that is that there's only experiments that are geared to you as an individual that you can do. That's the only thing that you have in life anyway, is that you have to figure out what do you need, how does this work for you, and then train and see what happens. Obviously, try to do that as smart as possible, but there's no guarantees. Nobody can give those to you. Now, another thing that I would suggest is cross-training with other practitioners. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to be in a formal setting, you going to a different class, but you can go into your friend's garage and ask, hey, you've got a buddy who's a boxer. Just ask him, could you help me out test some of the defenses that we have against punches, and you punch from your perspective, the way that you're used to throwing a punch, and I'm going to see if I can make my stuff work. Obviously, you need a friend you can trust to not be an asshole and try to hurt you, but it's one of the things that I've done many times, trying to find different people to train with and say, hey, how do you do that? And let's play a little bit and see how we can learn and grow. Or you can ask a friend who is a wrestler or a BJJ guy or whatever, and see how he tries to take you down and test your takedown defense and see what happens. In many cases, this can be a very sobering experience, when sometimes we notice that what we thought was actually quite good technique had some really important problems that you cannot ignore. Once you see how somebody with a different perspective just blasts straight through that technique because of the way they train, because of their methods. It doesn't necessarily happen all the time, but it does happen. And then again, you have to draw your own conclusions. And I think that's the overall point. If you notice that your style is only really effective when it is used against people from either your own style or people who fight in a similar way, I think you're going to have to make some choices. Once again, looking at your style, looking at your actual needs, and then figure out if you can make it work for you in a realistic fashion, or if you need to do something else, and whether that means finding a complementary style or starting to work with people from different styles and maybe fine-tune your style so it's more versatile. That's up to you. That's everybody has to make those decisions for them, for him or herself. So that's pretty much my answer. I hope that was helpful. And at the same time, we're pretty much now also at a close of this episode. So I want to thank everybody who sent me the questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but as always, if you have questions you'd like me to answer on the podcast, just send me a note on, you can contact me on Facebook. That's the easiest way, or on my blog, whatever. Just send me a note, send me a message, and I will add your questions to the list. And I'll eventually do another one of these Q&A sessions for the show. So that said, if you want to support the show, obviously, as always, like, share, subscribe. That would be awesome. I will make sure that the show notes will be on my blog again. So how do you get to the show notes? Go to wimsblog.com/16. So that's the number 16, wimsblog.com/16. And I'll take you to the page on my blog where all the things that I talked about here in this episode will be available for you. Also, if you want to support the blog, the blog and the podcast, you can support me on Patreon, and I'll put a link there as well, and get access to some additional content. Sorry, I'm fumbling my words here. And finally, let me see. I have some more interviews scheduled It's been a little bit tricky with planning, mostly because of work and stuff on my part, but I have some really cool interviews planned that I'm not going to announce just yet, but stay tuned for some announcements, because if I can manage to get all the guests that I'm trying to get on the show, you should all be pretty excited about it, because I know I am. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Will Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wilmsblog.com.